So, because when I were late, there was a delay at the train station. After that day. So the trains were late. Yeah. We were in university for like 30 minutes. Like, we got to the show 30 minutes late. Like 2 hours. Yeah, and that's time. But yeah, they said they had some dinner table and they acted like the beef on like wooden tape. And then
Well, everyone, good evening. Happy to have you here. Welcome to the first Theology on Tap of the year. I thought that it would be appropriate to start the year off on Ash Wednesday as we take this time to journey forth and really take the time to say, okay, like, you know, where are we at? Like, take an inventory, like, where are we at in our spiritual journey? Where are we at with God? Where are we at with our community? And what are some things that we can do to improve? And at least for me, one of the things that has been very useful for me throughout my development, and I'm talking all the way back to when I was an adolescent up until now as a grown adult, is I always learn through stories. And for me, stories have been an integral part of my development. And I find that a lot of the lessons that I've learned from stories have been really useful. And the particular types of stories that have been transformational for me typically have been in the realm of fantasy. I've always been enthralled by heroes of the past, present, and future, you know, mythology, the onset of technology and video games, and now we're diving into AI, and Lord only knows where that's going to go, right? And so I came up with the idea, well, why don't I do a talk on that, on how we as men and women can learn from the stories of the past, the present, and the future, and see how we can functionally apply that to our lives. And that seed that I had a few years ago ended up, you know, developing a niche for me, ironically, in my coaching, and also led to all these different ideas, and this talk was one of them. And I gotta say, it was really hard to come up with this talk because there are so many different stories that I wanted to share, but in order to keep it to an hour, I had to get like really specific, and I had to pick and choose wisely. And just to let you know, in no way, shape, or form tonight are we going to be able to fully express or fully dive into the themes. I have to be very selective. And so some of you who are familiar with these stories or are fans of some of these particular things that we're going to talk about, I highly encourage after for questions and discussion, because I know that in some ways we may only be able to scratch the surface. So without further ado, let's go ahead and let's get started. So the title of this talk is Fantasy and Function. And of course, literally, as I'm about to start, the screen turns black. But that's fine, because we'll go ahead and we'll fix that. There we go. So, I like to think in terms of journeys. And my purpose tonight is to take you on a quest. And today's quest is for us to see how we can look at stories and apply them to our own lives. Now, the way that I set this up, okay, is there's 5 key elements of fantasy, okay? There's the elements, natural elements, which are usually present in stories. And these are usually things like fire, ice, lightning, things that have meaning, symbolically speaking, water. Then you have the setting in which it takes place, the time, if it's fantasy, if it's an alternate universe, if it's something that is in the future or in the past. The theme, these themes are usually moral. Some can be universal or some can be more specific. So obviously, typically speaking, the general themes that we see in most stories are good versus evil. And then subsequently after that, dives into morality, identity, the idea of being chosen or having a destiny. The fourth element is conflict. Now, this is typically the most interesting part of fantasy, right? It's the big battle, it's the epic showdown, it's where we see how good and evil clash, and how the heroes transform, and how the villains also play a part in that conflict. And then the last element are the characters themselves. And the characters are really important because with those characters, we can step into the shoes of that individual, and we can place ourselves in that person. And typically, that's where we compare ourselves, like, is that something that I struggle with? Is that character me, or am I so removed from that character that I can't understand him or her at all? So, those are the 5 features we're going to analyze tonight in all of our different mythology and hero stories. Since this is about function, okay, I gave you a couple of sheets of paper for those of you who want to take notes. One of the things that I'm really big on is this talk starts out there. So if you came here tonight and you enjoyed the talk, that's awesome. But if I didn't give you something to actually help you out there, then I failed my job. Because this really is beneficial out there. It's not beneficial here. I don't want this to be only something for entertainment. I want it to be something that, God willing, will be useful for you. And so, a couple of things for you to think about, okay? So, the elements. Are there any, throughout the stories that we share, think, are there any elements that you happen to identify with? And if they have any meaning for you, what meaning could that be? The setting. Think about the setting of your life right now. Where are you right now? Where would you like to be? The theme. Have you given any thought to what your personal destiny is? And you do have a destiny. Because we believe that God put us here for a purpose. So each and every single one of us here does have a destiny. The question is, have we identified that? And if so, are we acting it out? In terms of conflict, life is not easy. And each and every single one of us right now has some sort of struggle, some sort of challenge, or some sort of battle that we're facing. I'm not immune, and neither are you. And so, hopefully, through the stories tonight, maybe you'll glean a perspective that maybe you didn't have before about the conflicts that you're going through. But take heart. Think about also as well, have there been any conflicts that you've overcome recently? And if you have, give yourself credit, because that's really important. Characters. Think about characters that may stand out to you tonight. Think about why that is. And who you can relate to. And then last, which is most important, application. After tonight, think about how you can apply what we discuss. And also think about where you can find support. Because this journey is not meant to be alone. And if it wasn't for my friends, my family, my mentors, my coaches, I don't even think I would even have the courage or the ability to be able to stand here in front of you today and actually talk about this. Because this is not who I was 10 years ago. And this is certainly not who I was 15 years ago. And so we've all gone through transformations. And the more that we can tap into other people and find support, the better we can go. So, without further ado, let's get started. And of course, I have to start with Christ. I don't know about you, but every single time that I go to church, something happens. Every single time that we read from the Gospels, my ears perk up. And at least for me, I find the reason why that is because typically we hear Jesus speak. We hear Jesus give a parable. We hear Jesus interacting with people. And I find that those types of stories are the ones that stick the most. Not that I don't listen to the other readings, but I find that because Jesus was a master storyteller, he was able to captivate the hearts of many. And what's interesting about Jesus is that Jesus used both real stories, but he also used parables. And if you think about it, parables are a type of myth. They're typically based on fictional characters, but they have real life lessons. And he did that on an ongoing basis. Jesus was a master of actually helping people understand how to live better through the power of stories and myth. And I think that's the reason why Jesus was so captivating to many different people. And so, in some small way, shape, or form tonight, I hope to be able to captivate you with the stories that we're going to go through. So, let's go ahead and get started. Let's go way back, all right? Has anyone here ever read any Greek mythology? Quite a bit of you, okay. So, you know Hades, you know Zeus, you know Hercules, you know Hera, you know Prometheus. One story that at least I found that was not very commonly told was the story of Pandora's box. Now, Pandora's box is very interesting. So, let's analyze Pandora's box. First of all, Pandora was the first created human being. So she's the equivalent of Eve in Christianity. Now, what's very interesting about Pandora is that she was actually made by the smith god Hephaestus, like a machine. But the other gods granted her unique gifts. One of the gifts that they gave her, which was from Zeus in particular, was the gift of curiosity. She was the most curious being created at the time, even more curious than the god. The second gift that Zeus gave her was a box. And he gave her these specific instructions. Under no circumstances are you to open this box. Now you may be thinking, why would Zeus give the most curious person ever a box that she could not open under no circumstances?
Free will. Giving her an option.
Free will?
It was a curse.
It was a curse. Okay. So, you're both right. Now, that's the moral of the story. Fast forward a couple of decades later, she could no longer resist the temptation to open the box. She opened it. Two very interesting things happened. The first time she opened the box, all of the evils of the world that Zeus had created were set. They were released. She closed the box immediately, but it was too late. She realized what she had done. She freaked out. She's like, I just let out war, pestilence, disease, death, everything. She literally went into a corner, the story says this, and she just crawled and she didn't know what else to do. So she's like, well, I don't know what else to do, so I'm going to open the box a second time. The second time, something very interesting happened. When she opened the box a second time, a small light came out of the box. It's like a small, faint blue light. What she had just released into the world was hope. That's very interesting. And so Zeus knew that eventually Pandora would open the box, but he didn't necessarily set her up to fail. He also gave humanity the tools to fight back against all these evils. So we have war, we have pestilence, we have death, we have disease, but now we have hope. And if you analyze the human virtues, you can see that throughout whatever adversity we may go through, hope is a driving force that gets us through it all. Zeus wanted to punish humanity because of Prometheus, because Prometheus gave fire to humanity. So he created this box because he thought that humans would have the advantage due to fire. And that's one of the key elements into the story. Because the interesting thing about fire is that it is destructive in nature. It burns things down. But if you think about it, if it wasn't for fire, we wouldn't have any innovation. Like this microphone that I'm speaking to right now is literally the product of fire. That's how we learned energy. That's how we learned thermodynamics. That's how we came up with computers. It's because of fire. And so a fire can burn a forest down. It can make gunpowder. It can make guns. But it can also make technology that makes our quality of life better. And that's the very interesting about fire. The themes, which are interesting, is that if you notice, one item, Pandora's box, was both responsible for the greatest evils, but it was also responsible for one of the greatest goods, which is hope. Pandora's box, just like AI, just like the internet, just like our cell phones, was a tool. And the tool ultimately boils down to how you use it. A tool is not necessarily evil. Money is not evil by nature, but if you have a distorted desire, you can use it for evil purposes. But that doesn't mean that money itself is evil. And so, the moral of the story with Pandora is this. Regardless of whatever mistakes you may make the biggest mistake of your life, but there's always mercy and there's always the opportunity to have hope and to come back through whatever difficulty that may be. And that's what we can learn from Pandora's box. Now, let's go into something a little bit more modern. Then we're going to talk about, as well, we're going to talk about heroes, and we're going to talk about anime. Alright? Now, for those of you who are not familiar with anime, that's fine. You don't have to be. But there's something very interesting about that type of content. So, we're going to talk about two stories. We're going to talk about a famous show called My Hero Academia, and we're going to talk about the American superhero Batman. Now, these two characters are very interesting because they're both heroes, but they're both opposites of each other. And we're going to see why. So, Batman analysis. I'm going to use the Batman from Christopher Nolan. So we're going to use the Christopher Nolan trilogy, Batman Begins, The Dark Knight, and The Dark Knight Rises. Okay, so this is that specific version of Batman. Alright, so, elements we see in that story. Science fiction. Okay? We see darkness, and we also see acid. Okay? Now, the story of Batman is interesting because it's set in Gotham City, but Gotham City is actually New York, is what it really is. It's based off of modern day New York. Okay? The themes that we see in Batman, we see vengeance, we see unfortunate circumstances, we see absolute evil, the fallen angel, and what happens when you pursue a singular goal. So the story of Batman is interesting because, for those of you who don't know, when Batman, his name is Bruce Wayne, was a kid, his parents were murdered right in front of him. And you ask yourself, well, how unfortunate could that be? I mean, you literally go watch a show with your family. You walk outside because you're not feeling well and you're scared of the show. A burglar comes and murders your two parents in front of your eyes. I mean, talk about the opposite. Like, when you think of a story, right, and you think of the chosen one, like someone who's born to save, to save the planet. What's interesting about that motif is that many times it's because of something bad that happens to them that causes them to pursue a singular goal. But he pursued that goal through vengeance, which is why he has that darkness to him. And he has a hard time making friends, really, because every single relationship that he has, with the exception of Catwoman, is one that never really develops. And he can never sustain a long-standing romantic relationship. So, for a man, Bruce Wayne is the epitome of what it means to be outwardly successful, but also at the same time somewhat inwardly empty. And what that means is he, as a man, did not fully go through the hero's journey. He became a hero because he saves people, but he never matured to the point where he could actually be the positive side as well. He can protect, he's successful, but he doesn't know how to establish long-term beneficial relationships. And so in many ways, although he's very good, he never made it to the full story. We also see that the conflict that he goes through is really unique in this story. And for me, I believe that this movie has one of the most epic lines in all of cinematic history. And it's posed in terms of a question. And it's literally said by the Joker. He says, what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object? What happens? It's like, if something is unstoppable, but something can't be pushed back, you have a clash. That was what happened between Batman and Joker. They were both so determined in their goals that they were fighting and duking it out, and Batman had a hard time. He really did. And he had to make some serious choices that ultimately cost him a lot, which is part of the reason why he was never able to fully go through his journey. But he was able to come out victorious, but he came out scarred. And the only small light he had in his life was Catwoman, but he was never fully able to mature that until the next movie, which is when he was able to beat Bane. And that's when he was able to fully come out. But it took him a long time to get there. And so I want to talk about Two-Face a little bit, because Two-Face in many ways is kind of like Satan, because Satan is a fallen angel. But what's interesting about Two-Face is that he's half scarred and half normal. And so he still retains some of those angelic elements that we see in someone like St. Michael, for example, but he's scarred. And so he has half of his face and half of his persona is scarred and satanic, but the other side is still trying to fight back and see, if he can redeem himself. Unfortunately, in the film, he wasn't able to do that. And so we see Batman here coming out of this, scarred, but still able to somewhat be functional, but never fully healed, because the thing about vengeance is that it leaves you empty at the end of the road. And if you go through the full, let's say his path started off as a vengeance path, but then he was able to forgive. And that's what we're called to do. We're called to forgive. Maybe not necessarily to forget, but we are called to forgive. He was never able to get to that point. And so even though he moved forward, he still kind of stayed stuck. He's the opposite of this hero. Now this hero, you may not know him, but his name is Deku. And what's interesting about Deku is that Deku was not born into a very difficult life. He was born into a normal household with a mother and a father who would come from time to time. But what's interesting about his story is that he was born into a world where 80% of the population had superpowers, but he didn't. And so, although he had a normal upbringing, everyone around him was different, and he was the only one who was not unique. Until one day, he met a hero who was actually able to share his power with him. And he ended up becoming a hero, not because of his ability, but because he showed the character traits of what he could become. And so he demonstrated to this one person that he could stand up and fight. He stood up against this big villain, kind of like David versus Goliath. And what's interesting about that scene is, David had a slingshot, right? David threw that slingshot, hit Goliath square in the middle of the head, and that's how he was able to win the fight. In this story, Deku throws his backpack, but what's interesting is that he throws it in such a way that is very similar to the same way that you would throw a slingshot. So that was a very intended motif. The difference here is that the backpack didn't do anything to the villain, but what it did is it inspired the heroes behind him to go and attack, because they were all scared. Ironically, the only person who was not a hero was the only person who decided to do something. But after that, he inspired all the heroes. And because of that, he was actually able to earn the trust and actually have these powers passed on to him. And he ended up becoming the greatest hero of all time. Now, That doesn't mean that he didn't have his difficulties, because in his story, he had to go up against what's potentially the biggest evil of all time. A very similar story to the Joker. This guy wanted nothing but to end society as we knew it. He wanted to get rid of all the heroes. He wanted to get rid of society and just start over from scratch, because he thought he could build it back better. And so what we see in the show, interestingly enough, is they dive a lot into morality. What is absolute good? What is absolute evil? And what we find out in the show, the same way in our theology of morality, is that it's not always black and white. A lot of times, you may do something and you may not be fully culpable of it. There's one character on the show which is really interesting. She was born with the equivalent of a psychological disorder that made her want to act like a vampire. And her unique ability was, if she sucked your blood, she could transform into you. Now, what's very interesting there is that they dive into nature versus nurture. If your nature is you have to bite people in order to live, then that means you're going to act like a vampire. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're evil. If you're biologically predisposed, the same way like a dog or a wolf is biologically predisposed to hunt, does that make them evil? No. They're acting out what they're supposed to do. But what this story was trying to show is that what happens if you have someone who's born and they're mentally ill? Are they fully capable for the decisions? Some people would argue that, yes, they are. But we know, because of mercy, that it's not their fault. They're just acting the way that they were born. And so showing mercy is really important. Now, of course, our environment plays a role. I'm sure many of us here have met people who were potentially born into really difficult circumstances, but somehow were able to go on ahead and be very successful. We all know people like that. So there is an element of our personality that comes into play, but our environment also plays a role. And this show does a really good job of talking about the idea of relativism. Because the main villain in this story basically says, well, we just do whatever we want. There's no good, there's no evil. It's just based off of power. And we know that that's not true. It's not relative. There are values. And it's up to us as men and women to say, how are we going to cultivate our virtues and how are we going to dispel our vices? And in our own capacities, we can all think about how we can best serve each other and see, okay, is my environment being optimally controlled? Am I doing what I can to surround myself with good people? Am I staying away from negative influences? Am I spending my time productively? Because even if we have predisposition to bad character traits, we can ultimately aspire to be better if we equip ourselves with the tools that will help us improve. And this story does that very well. And so, moving on from that, I want to talk a little bit about a couple of movies. And these are iconic films. I mean, the Harry Potter series and Lion King are two very good stories that dive into morality in general and themes. So let's go ahead and let's start off with The Boy Who Lived. So for those of you who are not very familiar with Harry Potter was born and normal kid, you know, born into a loving family, two parents, but guess what? There was this evil wizard by the name of Voldemort who was going around eliminating good families because he wanted to take down society. Very similar to the villain in My Hero Academia. These villains are very similar, very relative, all based on power, and they want to collapse society. Very different, very similar, I should say. But what's interesting though is that for whatever reason, this little baby was able to repel the most powerful curse from this wizard, and the curse actually bounced back and almost killed Voldemort. but it left this scar on Harry's head. And that's very interesting. Voldemort has the ability to talk to snakes. Who do we know from the Bible who was a snake in the Garden of Eden? Satan. Now, what's interesting about the story of Harry Potter and Voldemort is that Harry actually gets some of Voldemort's ability because of the curse in his forehead. So he inherited the ability to speak to snakes, and he also inherited some innate powers that made him a more powerful wizard, which is really interesting. Now, if you notice, in the book of Exodus, and this is really cool, when the people rebel against God, what does God do? He sends a plague of snakes, and the snakes start biting people, and they start dying. Moses says, God, look, we messed up. We're really sorry. Can you remove this plague, please? And he says, sure. I want you to build a statue in the shape of a bronze serpent, and I want people to look at this serpent, and that will heal them. That's very interesting. Psychologically speaking, there's something there that's very profound. In order for you to be able to fight back against the greatest evils, you have to be able to stare at it long enough and stand up for yourself and fight back. And you have to understand evil. Because if you don't understand what evil is, you won't be able to fight back. So I found it interesting that Harry inherited the ability to communicate with snakes. So think about that. He inherited the ability to communicate with evil. And that gave him an edge against Voldemort. Now, the way the story ends is that we see the theme of sacrifice, death, and rebirth. In the story, there's actually a phoenix. And the phoenix is actually an ancient Greek symbol, which was known for rebirth. And there's a scene in a couple of the movies where the phoenix actually dies and it explodes. But then in the ashes, it's reborn anew. That same phoenix is a phoenix that delivered the sword to Harry in the second movie, which helped them defeat Voldemort, and also in the last movie helped them again in the final battle. Now what's interesting is that in the final battle, Harry actually dies. He dies. And there's a scene where he's talking in his subconscious with Albus Dumbledore, who is basically the mentor in this story. And he asks Harry, like, what do you want to do? You have two choices. You can either take the bus and go, or take the train and go to heaven, or you can go back and fight. And it's up to you. And what's interesting is that when we're down on our knees and we're going through the most difficult circumstances in life and we're at death's door, we have that same choice. We can either quit or we can fight back. And even if we lose some battles, because we're bound to lose some, we're not going to win every day. As long as we learn, we can be reborn. And the second time around, we're a little bit stronger than the first time, and we can fight back, and maybe we can win. So every single time that you experience a small loss in your life, remember that that is also your greatest lesson. That little bit of poison that you have from that snake bite can end up becoming an antidote as long as you're able to integrate it and apply it in a way that makes you wiser the second time around. And that's the cool thing about life, is that you get more than one chance. As long as you don't quit, you don't keep going, you get more chances. And this series shows that very well. Another good thing that is showed in this story is that Harry, at some point, has to leave the school, the wizarding school that he was invited to, because Voldemort and all the evil wizards, they came and they took over the school. And so just like we saw in Exodus, that the Jews were called, they were forced out of their original homeland and forced out of slavery, it wasn't the end of the story. Because just because you leave something bad, before you can actually stabilize yourself and become the hero, you're wandering in the desert. So let's say you're in a bad relationship, for example. And I've had a couple, not anymore, thankfully, because I'm married. But I've had a couple of bad relationships, and you get out of that relationship, and you're like, okay, now what? I'm out of that relationship, but now I'm stuck. Like, I'm wandering. I don't know what to do. It's uncomfortable. But at least you're out of the bad place. And now you're wandering towards something better. But that's how you can think about it. As long as you're able to withstand that period of desert, you ultimately get to a better place. And that's true for all of us, whatever that final destination may be. Another story that does a very good job of talking about the cycle of life and death is The Lion King. In the opening phase of that movie, there's a lot of depth. And maybe you were like me and you hadn't seen The Lion King in many years. If you haven't seen The Lion King in many years, I definitely recommend you rewatch it. I rewatched The Lion King in the last 3 years. I rewatched it twice. And the reason why is because I caught so many things. And in the opening scene of The Lion King, Simba is basically treated like a king, because that's what Pride Rock is. It's a kingdom. And what's interesting about the whole story of Lion King is that it's based off of the Shakespearean play Hamlet. And Hamlet is about a kingdom. And we see in this story both sides of masculinity. Mufasa, which is Simba's father, is the positive side of masculinity. Scar, which is Simba's uncle, is the negative side of masculinity. Now what happens is that eventually Scar tricks the innocent Simba into leading his father, the king, Mufasa, into a stampede. So Simba at this point is very naive and he's childlike. And he wants to be this king, but he's kind of like a goofball. And he thinks that being a king means I get to order people around, I get to do whatever I want. And so Scar notices that, oh, there's a chance here for me to manipulate him. So he does that. Through that manipulation, he actually ends up murdering Mufasa. He blames Simba, makes it seem like it's Simba's fault, and Simba runs away. What's interesting is that in this film, he ends up in the desert. When he's running away, he runs into the desert and he collapses. So what's that? Another example of Exodus. Same story. But this time, there happened to be, by the grace of God, so to speak, a pig and a meerkat. And this pig and this meerkat rescue this dying lion and bring him to this oasis. Now this oasis is where he learns the idea of Hakuna Matata. No worries. They sing, they dance. Simba grows up. Now remember, Simba was next in line to be a king, but he left that past behind. And so one of the themes here is the abdication of responsibility. So we have the choice, right? I mean, we can run away from whatever responsibilities we have, and we can live like children forever. And that goes for both men and women. We can do that. We don't have to grow up. We can be like Peter Pan. But what happens is that eventually, the past will come back and haunt you. I didn't mention in the beginning of the story, but in the beginning of the story, there's a lioness by the name of Nala. Nala plays a very important role in the story because she's the positive manifestation of femininity. And what Nala does is Nala says, you bonehead, what the heck are you talking about? You're a king. What are you doing here in the middle of nowhere, playing around with a meerkat and a hog? And it's like, don't you care about your family? Like, your mom is still there. Your dad may be dead, but your mom is still there. All the other lions are suffering. This tyrannical king has basically destroyed our entire kingdom. Like, aren't you gonna come and fight back? And at first he was hesitant, and he was like really like a kid, like I don't want that. I'm not cut out for that. And then she's like, whatever, dude, and she leaves him. After that conversation, which is that image right there, he goes into an opening, a clearing, and he looks up at the sky, and then his father appears in the clouds. Now what's interesting is that we see that when Jesus would go into an opening field, he would go into a field, when he was baptized. Well, what happened? God spoke through the heavens. So right now, Mufasa has manifested pretty much as God the Father. And he's looking at his son, Simba, he's looking at Jesus, and he's saying, remember who you are. Like, you are more than what you think you are. Because Jesus was human, but he was also divine. He had two natures. And so every time that Jesus felt weak and he would go to the mountain, he would pray, he would beg for relief, God said, remember, you're more than who you are. Now after that, something really cool happens. Okay? Simba walks out of that conversation, and he's changed now. He's ready to face his responsibilities. There's a really cool, I don't want to call it like a montage, but it kind of is. It shows Simba, now an adult, running back through the desert to his old kingdom. I get goosebumps when I think about it. Because in the beginning of the movie, when he went through the desert, he was going through as a weak, poor, innocent little kid. But the second time, he's coming back as this fully grown, masculine, developed lion who's ready to fight back and take his kingdom back. He's ready to fight back against Scar. And what we see there is that even though a kingdom can rise, it can also fall. Think of Rome. Rome was the most prosperous society to date. They estimate that in terms of wealth, Rome had trillions, according to modern day standards. But Rome fell. So if Rome can fall, one of the things we have to be aware of, that we can fall too. And if we're not careful, if we're not wise with how we conduct ourselves personally and with the people around us, our society could collapse. It could. We're not immune. What makes us any different from Rome? What makes us any different from Greece? What makes us any different from any other society that was successful? We're not immune. And so we have to think that we have a personal responsibility to face our own personal issues and be able to actually play our role and play our part in whatever thing that we can do. Because what's interesting is that by virtue of our baptism, we are kings. We are. Read it. It's in the New Testament. We're all kings, which is very interesting. So even us, in our small role in God's divine plan, we are also royalty. And so we, just like Simba, have the opportunity to face our challenges head on and learn. And I think that the last thing that I wanted to discuss here is we pay a price if we're ignorant. If we choose to duck and cover, we pay a price. Think about if you get let's say your check engine light turns on in your car. In that moment, you have a choice. You can either take it to get it checked out of a mechanic or your dealership, or you can ignore it. You do that for a few months, that small problem may end up becoming a really big problem. And that goes with anything. I don't know about some of you here, but I'm not the most organized person, and I've certainly gotten better. But we all know what happens is you put a sock here, you put a shirt there. Before you know it, you have a mountain of laundry on the floor, and it's disgusting. If you would have just taken that one thing and put it in the basket, or washed that dish, maybe your whole sink wouldn't be messy and full with cockroaches. True story. So, point is that if you ignore problems, you can ignore them in the short term, but long term, they catch up to you. And lastly, I want to share one example of a very good video game which I found was really useful for me. So this series is called the Kingdom Hearts series, and it's a combination of Disney and Final Fantasy, which is really interesting. How this came to be was back in 1999, an executive from Disney and an executive from Square Enix happened to get into an elevator at the same time. Literally in that 60-second elevator, they had a full-blown conversation, and the idea for what would become a multi-million-dollar video game series was born by chance. Very interesting. And so in this series, we see classic Disney characters. We see Mickey, we see Donald, we see Goofy, but then we see these new characters called Sora, Riku, and Xehanort. And what this video game series does very well is it personifies the idea of light and darkness and really talks about, in depth, the idea of what it means to have a soul. And the idea of what happens when we allow our hearts to be and our emotions to take over. Because, as you know, emotion can be a positive force. It can also be a negative one. And what's interesting is that if you take a look at every emotion, there's two sides to it. If you take a look at anger, there's righteous anger, but then there's the dark side of anger, which is fury. And so the same trait where we see Jesus in the temple and he's flipping over tables, right? How dare you sell things in my father's, how dare you turn my father's house into a marketplace? That's righteous anger. But then we see, you get mad at your spouse and you start yelling at them, you start cursing at them. I've never done that, thanks be to God. But when you do that, you're letting out the same emotion, but in a negative way. And now you're hurting people. You're hurting your relationships. And so we have to remember that, just like with Pandora's box, curiosity is a two-sided coin as well. Because curiosity is what allows us to think and to plan and to create new ideas. But if you're too curious to the point where you lose the virtue of temperance or prudence, you can end up unleashing great evils. And so this series does a very good job of talking about what happens when you allow your soul or your heart to be tainted. And time travel. This is very interesting. This series had a very interesting take on time travel. Now what happens is that if we all had time machines, maybe we could think of a time where we wanted to go back. But what ends up happening is that in this series, every single time the villain would go back in time, he would cause something else to change, which ultimately ended up becoming his defeat, which was really interesting. And so it begs the question, are you better off accepting responsibility for your mistakes the first time round? Or if you could be given infinite do-overs, would you make it better or would you make it worse? Now I think all of us can think of something really embarrassing. Now for me, when I was 18, I had a knee surgery, which had me do 7 months of physical therapy. Now I think to myself, if I could just go back and prevent myself from going to that tournament, could I have avoided this? Maybe. Maybe I could have caused something worse. Maybe there was a grace. Maybe there was a lesson in disguise. Because I can tell you this changed me. That 7 months of therapy changed the way that I make decisions. Because I was very bold and very rash, and I have to go, but no, the car broke down, and we had to get a rental car, and we ended up getting to the tournament late, and I lost my cup. I had to go to Walmart, and all these things. I missed the weigh-in. It's like all these things were happening. Like, no, I gotta go. I get to the tournament, second round of the fight, guy kicks my knee, boom, over, done. Even though I was winning, it doesn't matter. Because I got disqualified for my injury. So all that, but now I'm a different person. I'm more prudent. I'm wise. I'm different. So every time you think about going back in time and changing your past, think about how that decision maybe, just maybe, made you to the person who you are now and made you better. And so that series does that very well from a negative perspective. And so in conclusion, I want you to understand this. Fantasy is great. I love stories. And I hope that these stories have been beneficial to some way, shape, or form. But ultimately, we can't live in Fantasyland. We live here, we live right now, and we live out there. And so, my desire for you is that your personal adventure, your personal life story ends up being greater than any fantasy. And that you can learn from your mistakes. That you can learn by surrounding yourself with good people. That you can learn that your journey doesn't have to be one that's lonely. It's going to be challenging, it's going to be difficult. But remember, going back to the beginning, whatever evils may be released into the world, we still have hope. And on that note, I would like to say thank you for coming to my talk. And so, I'd like to open up, if anyone has any questions or any discussion, I'd like to open up the floor to anyone who wants to talk at all.